Say Bawaze Balan Salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As we all know, Brother Azhar Abedi started his first lecture last night. He had some introduction, which he talked about himself, and also he lined down what he's going to be talking about. So I want all of you, if you have questions after the majlis is done, he comes with all the references here. You could always ask him. And that's how you will get some of the answers, because not everything you'll catch on to while the lecture is going on, because he has come with a lot of research. And let's, go ahead and get yourself enhanced with it. Wassalam.
Thank you. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Are we all here? Salawat. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, that's better. Thank you. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I seek refuge with Allah from Satan the accursed. I begin in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise and glory is due to God, whose blessings cannot be counted by the counters, whose worth cannot be described by the speakers, and whose homage cannot be adequately paid by the worshippers. None can fully understand him, reason cannot visualize him, human faculties of perception, intuition, and conception cannot fathom the extent of his majesty. Words cannot describe him. There was no time when he did not exist, and there will not be any duration without his existence. He created the universe with his omnipotence, and he knew the detail of everything before he brought it into existence. I testify that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, is the servant and the prophet of God. Almighty God has placed his trust with Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. They are the group who protect his commands, and they are the group who explain and spread his message. So with those powerful words of the successor to our prophet and our first Imam, Imam Ali alayhi salam, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. So I'm sure those who were here yesterday remember the objective of my talks. I see some new faces here today, so it may be worth just briefly recapping. We are trying to meet God's expectations through understanding the Holy Prophet's life and his sayings and his traditions and following him. The Quranic verse which I narrated yesterday, which forms the basis of my theme, is the one from Surah Ahzab, verse number 21. You have indeed in the Messenger of God an excellent model for those of you who have hope in God and in the last day, and those of you who remember him frequently. Another verse of the Quran talks about the Prophet as a model is from Surah Anbiya, verse number 107, where the Prophet was sent as a mercy to the worlds and as a model for people on earth. So last night I explained the position of the Prophet, his soul's creation before anything else was created, and the fact that God endowed or gave the Quranic knowledge to the Prophet's soul before it was embodied on earth. I also talked about God's love for the Prophet. I quoted a hadith Qudsi where God says, "Were it not for you, O Muhammad, I would not have created the universe." And then I sort of, towards the end, concluded by saying the best ethical stance that we as Muslims can take in today's world is to think carefully, ask ourselves, faced with any situation, how the Prophet would have behaved, how he would have dealt with people that he would have encountered. Now, the history books have recorded the Prophet's life in a lot of detail. The different stages of his life, his ethics, his worship, his behavior, everything is recorded, even the way he walked, he talked, or the way he joked even. There's actually an incident about the Prophet used to sometimes joke because his followers and his companions were so much in awe of him that they used to take him very seriously, hang on to every word of his. So sometimes he used to use humor to get them closer. And as I said yesterday, unlike some other leaders, the Prophet lived amongst the people. He lived a life of his generation with a wife, children, friends, not a life of spiritual pursuits and spending time in the mountains. So my plan over the next 10 days, inshallah, is to cover 10 different topics relating to the Prophet's life. So tonight, we will talk about his infallibility, which is a fundamental part of the prophethood. Tomorrow and the future nights will be the Prophet's character, his family life, his leadership, his charity, the importance that the Prophet placed on knowledge, his spirituality, how he spread the message, what tactics did he use, can those help us today now? And more importantly for our current times, how his image has been distorted. In the current, almost everything goes. People can say anything about the Prophet these days, which they wouldn't be able to do for other religious leaders. And I'll conclude, inshallah, with the devotion, some of the devotional activities that are done for the Prophet. So infallibility is fundamental to the Prophet's role. As a model, as a teacher, as an educator, if he wasn't protected by infallibility, I don't think people would have had the confidence to follow him and to emulate him. Because, and this is in general terms, I think this applies to any prophet, the position of prophethood carries huge responsibility. And the key quality that is necessary is the strength of character, the piety that stops a person appointed as a prophet from, God forbid, any sin. And you can actually go as far as to say not only should a person in that status commit any sin, he shouldn't even be considering any sin. And that part of sinlessness should be applied not just to his life after the announcement of his mission, but prior to it as well. Now, if one goes through the context of the Prophet's life, there is not a single instance that people can quote where he made a wrong statement or a wrong judgment or did an incorrect action. On the contrary, there's a couple of examples I want to give where the Prophet showed enormous leadership, enormous thinking and negotiation. First is the Medina, what's known as the Medina Constitution. Now, this is 1400 years ago. Nobody had heard of constitutions. And when he migrated from Makkah to Medina, he found Medina, multiple tribes, some Jewish tribes too. And one of the things he put together was a constitution which basically committed each tribe to peaceful coexistence and supporting each other if there were outside attacks. So I don't want to go through into a lot of detail, but essentially this was a a very rudimentary form of a pluralistic society which he had created in Medina, which was way ahead of his time. And the benefit of that was peace, because there was a whole period of tribal warfare and tribes fighting against each other. The other significant achievement was what's known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Now, this Treaty of Hudaybiyah was a masterpiece in negotiations. I'm sure quite a few people have heard about it. It was essentially the Prophet wanting to go on the short pilgrimage to Makkah after he had already migrated to Medina, and the Makkans trying to stop him from entering Makkah. Most of the companions of the Prophet at the time wanted to fight to get in. And of course, the Prophet's wisdom enabled them to stop the violence. He negotiated this treaty, which in basic terms made sure that there was peace in the land for the next 10 years, so long as the Prophet would go back and come back the next year to do the Hajj and Umrah. And so it was taking a step back, but then 2 steps forward, because what that enabled him to do was, with peace now in Makkah and Medina, Islam could spread. Because when he migrated to Medina, there weren't that many Muslims. And the focus of the tribes could now move away, because there was no threats, there was no war. So people could then, the message of Islam could be spread, and more Muslims could add to the community, so that when he went back in 12 months, the Makkans had no choice but to accept him. So these are a couple of examples of the Prophet's negotiation skills and his thinking. Now, of course, he also listened to advice. It wasn't as though the Prophet had all the answers. So, for example, if you think about the Battle of Khandaq, the Battle of the Trenches, the idea of digging the trenches was given to the Prophet by Salman Farsi, because he had seen that back in his homeland in Persia and knew that it was effective. So the Prophet was humble enough to accept suggestions from his companions. So now the Quran also tries to say to the people that the Prophet was removed from anything that causes doubt. Hence, in Surah Ankabut, verse number 48, God says, "And you did not read or write any book before it," i.e. the Quran. "This was in case the deniers should doubt concerning your prophethood." So such was the divine plan. Such was the plan that God had done for the Prophet, that he was orphaned at birth. And after 2 years, he was sent out into the desert with a wet nurse. So the Prophet grew in the desert, close to nature, closer to the elements, without the protection of a loving family, as it were. And this closeness to nature, I think, came through later in his life. And there are a number of examples where the Prophet was very conscious of the environment. He was very conscious of people wasting things. I mean, there are incidents where he stopped people from wasting water when they were doing wuzu. Or when the Prophet's army was marching, there was, on the way, I think, a dog had just given birth to some puppies, and he instructed the army to be careful and not to overrun the animals that were on the way. So small little incidents like that. Obviously he was an orphan. He had no father figure to introduce him to any of the wrong beliefs, God forbid, that were prevailing at the time. And then, of course, God's plan for delaying the announcement of his mission till he was 40 also had a purpose to it. And that was to impress upon the hearts of the people his truthfulness, his character, and his ideal conduct. The example of another small example of his conduct this is again before the announcement of his prophethood. was when he was in Makkah. And of course, the Kaaba at the time was still a center of worship, in the sense that it had a number of deities. Obviously, it wasn't monotheistic, but polytheistic beliefs. And I think the tribes had decided to reconstruct the Kaaba at the time, and they were fighting over who will put the Hajr Aswad, the meteorite, back into its place. So they couldn't agree which tribe should do it, and there was a argument and tension going on. Anyway, they managed to then say to themselves that, look, whoever next comes into this precinct, we will let him decide. And guess who walks in? The Prophet himself walks in. Well, he hadn't announced his prophethood at the time, but Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam walked in. And of course, they were all pleased to see the Prophet, and because he already had a good reputation. So they said, right, Muhammad, please, you decide. How should we solve this dilemma? And of course, the Prophet then came up with quite a clever method. He said, well, get me a sheet of cloth. And he placed the stone on the cloth and got the tribal heads to take hold of different ends of this cloth and lifted the thing, and then he placed the stone himself and resolved the animosity and the fighting that was going on. So the people themselves acknowledged his truthfulness, his integrity, by awarding him this title of Al-Amin, the trustworthy. Now it's interesting to note that this award was given by people who were jahil, effectively ignorant, and they were a divided people, and it was given to somebody who had no position. It was purely, through his actions and his words. And of course, Al-Amin is a very comprehensive meaning. It means that somebody you can trust in anything and everything. So, in summary, God's plan was to first bind the people with their own verdict on truthfulness, on integrity, on conduct, and the morality of the Holy Prophet. So when the first revelation was sent down by God, via Jibreel, it said, Iqra, read. And the Prophet is recorded as saying, I don't know how to. Jibreel then repeated the command, read. But this time, he said, in the name of God. And the Prophet could automatically start to read. Now, the explanation that I have come across behind this is the difference between the conscious and the subconscious mind. Now, man's subconscious mind is very different from the conscious mind. The subconscious mind apparently can hold a whole host of information going back to the start of time, start of the world. And even scientists, biologists are coming to support this theory. There are scientists sitting here, so I better be careful. But what I have read is that within the human body, each group of cells knows what is knowable from the beginning of the world. So whatever the cells make up your heart, presumably know everything that has to do with the heart and so on. But the point about there's for most of us, there's a veil between our conscious and subconscious minds. I think we access our subconscious mind when we are sleeping, and that's why you have dreams and things like that. But for the prophets, the veil was lifted. And they could then gain the knowledge for reading and everything else. Now, the Quran also says in Surah Nisa, verse number 65, we send the Prophet as givers of glad tidings and warnings so that no excuse should remain thereafter for human beings. So, first requirement for revelation, absolute sincerity and purity of the Prophet's soul. Second was the conduct and action, not only after the mission, but also before. Now also please note the environment that he grew up in, full of ignorance, the age of Jahiliyyah. Corruption was quite rampant. There were no civilized values or piety. So such an environment ought to have had the opposite effect to what the Prophet displayed, alhamdulillah. But through God's protection and awareness, he was immune to those nasty qualities. So there's another verse from the Quran, Surah Jinn, verse 26 to 28, where God himself is guarding the Prophet. So he says, "He alone is the knower of the unseen, and he does not reveal his secrets to anyone else, except to that one of the messengers whom he chooses. For verily he causes a guard, an angel, to march before him and after him, that he may know that indeed they have delivered the message of their Lord to mankind." So from this Quranic point of view, God himself is guarding the delivery of the message, the protection of the message. And then in terms of sinning and in terms of making mistakes, there are two types of sin. There's the absolute sin, which, God forbid, would be a rebellion against God. Anything that goes against God would be a rebellion, and the prophets are, of course, completely protected from that. Then there is another level of sin which is relative, where the standards expected from somebody at prophethood are different to you and I. Now, if, again, God forbid, if prophet was neglectful of God at any moment in time, that would be seen as an error. Now, for us, I think we'll be excused when we are busy in various things. So now, the crucial point to understand, I think, is, and I'm sure this question is probably arising in people's mind, is that if infallibility is a gift from God, and therefore not done consciously, then where is the merit? You know, if it was predetermined, pre-programmed, like angels, then what is the achievement of the prophet, or indeed any religious leader? But this is not the case. The infallibility is founded on faith and awareness, and more importantly, the awareness of the consequences of sin. Because the prophets and the imams can see those consequences clearly. If I can think of one quick example, a topical example, if you talk to the doctor in Dallas who was treating the Ebola patient who unfortunately passed away, if you asked him to drink from the cup that the patient had, you'll see that the doctor would obviously refuse, because he would know the consequences of doing that. So this God's vigilance is also confirmed by another verse from Surah Sa'd, verse number 28. In order that God might know that the messengers have fully conveyed to mankind the messages of their Lord, that he be fully aware of what the messengers possess, and that he knows full well the numbering of all these things in the world. So now a further point which I wanted to draw your attention to. The doctrines or the laws that the Prophet presented could not contradict human rationality, could not contradict human logic, because our human logic is also from God. So you can't have God giving you directives or commands that then conflict with your own logic and rationality. So no religious scripture says, as Islam does, that its teacher is the model to emulate in every respect. People of other religions were asked to believe in the message, but none of them were asked to follow the Prophet in every little detail. Hence my opening verse of the Quran from Surah Ahzab, Prophet as the excellent model. So the life of the Holy Prophet and the Ahl Bayt is nothing but Quran in action. As our respected Maulana, I think he reminded us yesterday, the Prophet said the Quran and the Ahl Bayt will never be separated. And the Quran also tells us, again in Surah Ahzab, verse 33, verily, God intends but to keep all impurities away from you, O household of the Prophet, and purify you with a thorough purification. Salawat. So God himself is the purifier of the household of the Prophet. And that's why we believe that this quality of infallibility extends to the close family and to the Imams. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, was asked, O son of the Prophet, what does infallible mean? To which he replied, it refers to one who clings fast to the rope of Allah. And the rope of Allah is the Quran. They do not separate from each other until the day of resurrection. And the Imam guides to the Quran, and the Quran guides to the Imam. Verily, that's why the Quranic verse says, verily, this Quran guides to what is most upright, i.e. our Imams, alhamdulillah. So how can we ordinary Muslims strive towards, well, not infallibility, because I don't think that's possible, but at least avoid major mistakes? I have some hadiths which can hopefully help us. One is from the Prophet himself. Verily, Allah protects from sin whoever obeys him, and whoever disobeys him does not benefit from his protection. Simple enough. And there are two hadiths from Imam Ali. First one, drawing lessons from past experiences gives rise to immunity. So what the Imam is saying is that we should learn from our mistakes. We can all make mistakes. Making the first mistake is fine, but if we repeatedly make that mistake, then obviously we haven't learned the lesson. And the Imam also says, verily, God-wariness is a protection versus sin. I talked about God consciousness yesterday. So God-wariness is a protection versus sin for you in your life, and a great profit for you after death. And finally, I want to stop this section of the speech by relaying a dua from Imam Ali alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad Muhammad. So in his dua, in his supplication, the Imam says, my God, I have no way to guard myself from sin except through your protection, and no way to attain good deeds except by your will. So I'd now like to switch to the fourth item that I had mentioned yesterday about the values that we can learn from the event of Karbala. The tragedy of Karbala was indeed a supreme sacrifice. We rightly commemorate this event with extreme sadness for the intolerable pains that were imposed on the Imam and the family by Yazid's army. But I felt that the danger was that this commemoration runs the risk of actually being an expression of our love and sympathy towards the Imam and his family, and not something from which we could learn some lessons in our current lives, not something that would reform our character. So I wanted to introduce some of these values of Ashura, because there's a book by Sayyid Jawad Naqvi, who's a scholar from Qum, and he's actually taken a new approach to this event of Karbala. Most commentators tend to look at it chronologically, looking at the events in time. But he has looked at it from the point of view of the purpose of the Imam's uprising. And he bases it on an inheritance statement that the Imam had left with his brother Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. And in this statement, the Imam is recorded to have said, "I'm not leaving Medina to rebel or to oppress or to transgress any of God's commands. I'm leaving Medina to reform the ummah of my grandfather. And the only methodology, the only tools I have is Amr bil Maruf and Nahi anil Munkar." Amr means to invite towards goodness, and Nahi means to forbid evil or forbid mistake. Now, according to the Quran, Amr bil Maruf and Nahi anil Munkar is the duty of the entire ummah. We should all be doing that in our lives. But it especially applies to the leader of the ummah, especially when he's witnessing that society is going against the message that the Prophet brought. Various innovations had crept into the faith, and therefore the Imam has a responsibility. So the first value that Sayyid Jawad Naqvi talks about is the value of covenant and responsibility. Because according to the Quran, Imamat, the position of Imamat, is a covenant from God. Now, the Imam could have had a number of options. He didn't have to stand up to Yazid, he didn't have to go to Kufa, he didn't have to fight. He could have taken refuge in the Kaaba, he could have gone north to Yemen, but this would not have been consistent with his responsibility. So he took the most brave action by standing up to Yazid's army. So now, each of these values are obviously fairly short. So I don't want, on each day I want to add one value so we can listen to those, reflect on those, and digest them. So now I want to continue with the last section of the speech, which is we were talking about the journey of the Imam from Medina to Makkah and then from Makkah to Kufa. So the place where the Imam heard news about Muslim ibn Aqil's death and the failure of his supporters in Kufa is a place called Zubala. So when he heard the news and he got the letter, he gathered his supporters, his followers around, and actually announced the fact that if people were thinking that there was a whole bunch of people in Kufa who were there ready to support the Imam, the situation had changed. And now the risks were completely different. So he was being upfront with the people and was saying that, if people wanted to leave, they were under no obligation to stay with him. Of course, we know that hardly anyone left. The Imam then continued with his journey, and after 2 further stops, came to a place called Sharaf. At dawn, after loading up with water supplies, he moved on, and by noontime, he could see at a distance what looked like an army, and it was Hur with 1,000 horsemen moving in his direction. When they came face to face, the Imam could see that Hur's army looked exhausted, thirsty, and he said to his brother Hazrat Abbas, "Feed these people and give them water." So even the animals were fed, and both Imam Hussein and Hazrat Abbas personally supervised that operation. After they were fed and watered, the Imam prayed and everybody followed, even Hur's people followed him. and then he started to move again. As he started to move, Hur intercepted him. And then the Imam, that riled the Imam, and he said to him, "May your mother be deprived of you, O Hur. What are your intentions?" And all Hur could say was, "By God, if any Arab had said that to me, I would have said, may your mother be deprived as well. But by God, your mother is so much respected and has got such a high position that I can't even think of saying anything like that." So clearly there were signs in Hur of what was to happen later on the morning of Ashura, when he crossed over, and was the only positive thing that happened in the morning of Ashura, which helped the family of Imam Hussein. I think my time is up. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.